Now, unless you've been living as a self-sufficient hermit these past years, you've likely noticed an annoying trend called inflation. Some nations have fared better than others for this, and the causes are multifaceted. Partially, we are still experiencing COVID-related supply chain and labor shortages in key industries. Partially, we are seeing the effects of increasing the money supply rapidly as a stimulus response to said COVID. The Suez Canal and Houthi strikes on shipping lanes haven't helped either. And we've seen a nice mixture of geopolitical instability, rising energy prices, and in some cases, economic mismanagement for temporary electoral gains. This has affected industries from auto manufacturing to egg manufacturing, from computer chips to discount jewelry, and from seafood to seaside resorts. But one place this inflation is curiously missing is in the illegal drugs market. In my home city, where cannabis is still illegal, a gram of weed cost 10 euros in 2014. A decade later, it still cost 10 euros. In that same time period, the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, an indicator used to measure inflation, has increased by roughly 24%. This means 100 euros in 2014 only has the buying power of 80 euros today. Now, this will affect every member of society, including low-level drug dealers and their higher-ups in the supply chain. So why is it that the prices remain stable this entire time? After all, drugs are addictive, and so if the price goes up, a dealer could just pass on the cost to their buyers, and the buyers would have no choice but to pay that price. This is a class of goods called inelastic goods, meaning that as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases by less than the increase in price. Furthermore, drugs are usually shipped in larger quantities, so a cartel will have to find a way of getting those kilos of drugs onto a vehicle, be it a truck, train, or cargo ship. All of these vehicles use fuel, which has gotten more expensive, let alone the fact that the cost of sending a shipping container has increased significantly. There are essentially two broad reasons as to why the price has not increased. Firstly, the economic environment has become more favorable for drug cartels. And secondly, consumer psychology plays a big role in the actual street price of drugs. In order to properly quantify the various drug markets, we first have to get an understanding of the possible market structures. To oversimplify things, we can create a spectrum with fewer players controlling a larger market share on the right and more players controlling less market share on the left. The two extremes are known as perfectly competitive, where you have infinite players but they each control a tiny market share with non-differentiated products, think of things like a bakery, and a monopoly, where you only have one player and they control the whole market. In the middle, closer to a monopoly, we have oligopolistic competition, where a few large players have most of the market share. And then closer to perfect competition, we have a name which was certainly only created to confuse economics students, monopolistic competition, where many firms have a low market share but with differentiated products. Let's have a look at the market structure for some of your favorite less than legal pastimes. Cocaine. The coca plant, the precursor to cocaine, requires a very specific climate to grow. This is why we find cocaine production almost exclusively in the mountains of South America, where Colombia represents about 70% of production and Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru representing the rest. The primary destination markets are Europe and the United States. The American supply is largely controlled by the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels. While in Europe, an interesting development is taking place. Albanian gangs have started horizontally integrating. This means they've moved further up the distribution line, going from street dealers to wholesale purchasers. This allows them to control both the import of the drug as well as the sale to the end customer. Simultaneously, producers in Colombia have become much more fragmented, meaning there's been an increase in small suppliers. The Albanians, often only having a few key figures living in South America, then arrange for huge transfers to major European ports, notably to Antwerp and Rotterdam. There are interesting parallels with how major supermarkets will purchase food in huge quantities and can therefore benefit from economies of scale, specifically bulk buying. They get better prices from farmers by letting them compete against each other. Similarly, being the biggest European importers, the Albanian gangs now have a disproportionately large bargaining power. This is probably the closest to a monopoly out of any of the drugs we will look at. Albanian gangs don't compete in American markets, and neither do Mexican cartels compete in European ones. On our scale, I would rank it somewhere around here. For the methamphetamine trade, the market is structured differently, and so there are different reasons as to why the prices remained stable this last decade. The so-called Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, the border area between Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, is one of the biggest international hubs for methamphetamine production, where the United Wa States Army controls a significant percentage of production. But there are also numerous small-scale labs set up by other smaller players. Mexico also sees similar industrial scale production, often by the Sinaloa cartel. There, the production chain is a bit more centralized, with there being few independent labs. In Europe, on the other hand, the market is almost exclusively run by small-scale production labs, or even individual chemists. And there's a larger focus on MDMA production, rather than the classical blue methamphetamine. These small-scale labs are particularly present in the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, and Belgium. Many of these operations collaborate with big existing drug cartels without being directly owned by them. This market structure is more similar in nature to an oligopoly, where price stability comes from the inherent competition existing between a few large players and a lot of small players. Furthermore, because the product doesn't need a specific climate to be grown, there is less in the way of international shipping concerns, which could prevent a degree of inflationary pressure. With the right chemicals, even you could produce meth in your own RV. On our scale, meth lands firmly in the oligopoly segment. When it comes to the production in the opium market, there's been a bit of a recent shakeup. Afghanistan used to be responsible for over 80% of global opium production. This was done largely by the Taliban in order to finance their activities. But ever since the US withdrew from Afghanistan and the Taliban regained control, they've made it illegal to cultivate, and the production has dropped by roughly 95%. There have been rumors of the Taliban using strategic reserves of opium in order to acquire foreign currency, but I couldn't find any official sources about it, so I will ignore this element for now. Other big players include the Golden Triangle, with which we are already familiar, and the Mexican cartels, who have specialized in synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl. Oftentimes, the precursor chemicals are shipped to Mexican labs through legal or semi-legal methods, and only assembled in Mexico, destined for the US market. Lastly, there is the legal market for prescription opioids. Here, many large pharmaceutical companies throughout the world produce opioids for generalized pain management. Opioids are, however, highly addictive, and patients who have them prescribed often end up addicted. This creates a large demand for prescription opioids, where through robberies at pharmacies or purposeful black market deals, criminal networks acquire these medicines to be resold on the streets. The opiates market can also be considered an oligopoly, however, a less concentrated one than the meth market. Opium can be grown in almost any temperate climate and is not particularly water intensive, so there are not the same geographic barriers as with cocaine. On our scale, opiates ranks in the bottom half of the oligopoly segment.
Smoke weed every day.
Cannabis is the most commonly used illegal drug in the world, and is a little bit of a special case. We're living at a time where it seems that legalization will broadly happen in most Western countries. As of the time of recording, Uruguay, Canada, Georgia, Mexico, Thailand, Malta, Luxembourg, South Africa, Germany, and certain US states have fully legalized cannabis, with many more countries having implemented legal gray zone rules, such as in the Netherlands or in Spain, or just decriminalized possession up to a certain limit. This means that cannabis is not a strictly black market as the other drugs we've previously looked at. For purely legal markets, there are essentially two structures: dispensaries and social clubs. Dispensaries usually source their cannabis from large-scale agricultural producers who grow either in an open field or in specialized grow facilities. Many small dispensaries will place orders with these farmers and then sell the products to the end consumer. This model is common in the US and Canada. Social clubs, on the other hand, exist mainly in countries where people have the right to grow a certain number of plants privately. These people will then give their plants to the clubs and periodically pick up cannabis in exchange for donations to the club. This system is a bit less transparent than dispensaries, but it limits the purchase to members of the club only. This is common in European countries. For the illegal production, the market is highly fragmented. One plant can yield up to 200 grams when properly tended to, meaning that there are many small players in a huge market. There are also some sophisticated large-scale production facilities, which are more common in North America and Europe. In South America, Africa, and Asia, often production is concentrated in small-scale operations. The main countries for large-scale illegal herb production are the United States and Mexico, followed by Colombia and Paraguay. In Africa, Nigeria is a major production hub, and for cannabis resin, that is hashish for the well-initiated, Morocco and Lebanon are significant sources. India and Afghanistan are also notable producers. The cannabis market is the closest to perfectly competitive we have seen so far. On our scale, cannabis lands firmly in the monopolistic competition segment, as differentiation in THC percentages can be made, but there are a lot of small competitors. So we have looked at market dynamics and how increasing efficiency means that prices can stay low. But there's a second part to the equation, the consumer psychology, and what I am calling the dealer danger deduction. Being a drug dealer on the street comes with inherent risks. It is illegal, and you may face prison time if you are caught. This means it is in your interest for transactions to happen quickly and quietly, away from the pesky eyes of law enforcement. Let's say you would be charging a price which had kept up with inflation for that gram of weed. Instead of receiving a simple €10 bill, in the best case you would receive one €10 bill, one €2 coin, and two 20-cent coins. The time it would take for you to check the value of the coins is time where you could get caught with your pants down in the middle of a transaction. This means the extra value you could gain by charging an inflation-appropriate rate for weed is less than the perceived risk you take for charging that price. But that's not all. There's a second layer to the dealer danger deduction. If there are many street dealers, say you are hanging out at a shady park, and you are the only dealer who raises their prices, consumers can very easily find a replacement. So the level of availability of alternatives for consumers is also a driver of lower prices. In the post-COVID world, inflation has eaten into a lot of people's savings. This is especially problematic for poor people, who themselves are more likely to have a drug addiction in the first place. Given that these are the most reliable customers for drug dealers, and that they have already seen a decline in disposable income, a drug dealer charging more for drugs during a period of high inflation will probably see less profit, not more, as only the most addicted users will choose drugs over other essentials like food and housing. So the macroeconomic environment also plays a role. But this begs the question, when do drug prices go up? There are 5 broad causes as to the increase in the street price of drugs. Number 1, when law enforcement makes a significant bust in either production or intercepts a significantly sized package. This happened in 2000, for example, when the DEA busted the largest ever LSD operation in a missile silo in Kansas. This lab was creating roughly 95% of the global supply. Number 2, if there are significant increases in the cost to transport drugs, both in terms of safety to the drug mule and transport costs themselves. This is the case in Singapore, for instance, where drug smuggling routinely carries the death penalty. A gram of weed in 2009 cost roughly $20, while in Myanmar, a gram cost roughly $1.5. With changing laws, the extra risk must be priced into the product. Number 3, when there's a sudden surge in demand, such as people attending a music festival in a small town, the localized prices may increase to levels significantly above the norm. Number 4, when competition is reduced, say when one cartel gains a monopoly over a certain drug market. This happened in Chicago, where the Sinaloa cartel has a quasi-monopoly over the heroin trade, and so was able to roughly double the wholesale price in a short period of time. And finally, when there is a significant increase in the purity of the drug, which means dealers can actually reasonably ask for a higher fee for a more premium product. Using a strict economic definition, the illegal drug market is not a free market. But in many ways, it still behaves like one. We have seen that as players become more efficient, the deflationary effects of economies of scale mean that prices can be kept low and profits still remain high. We also have to keep in mind drug dealers don't pay taxes, so all the profit they earn goes right into their pocket. The profit they actually do earn is often many multiples of the wholesale price. A kilo of cocaine in Europe goes for 30 to 50,000 euros. That same kilo sold in many 1-gram doses will earn dealers roughly 80 to 100,000 euros. There are not many other industries where you can reliably double your money like that in such a short period of time. Given that the demand for drugs is increasing worldwide and the incentive structures to provide them remain lucrative, perhaps it's time to slowly rethink our relationship with drugs. Perhaps governments could step in and provide a safe monthly doses for the most commonly abused drugs, offering not just the drug itself, but also methods to avoid overdose, or even just addiction counseling. At the end of the day, there are billions of tax dollars being used to enforce drug controls that have done very little to actually stop people from taking the drugs. The drugs have essentially won the war on drugs. In addition, all the money that is earned through the drug trade goes straight to the cartels, who have very little incentive to reinvest that money into the community. What if we taxed it? And what if we used that money to fund better schools, hospitals, or public transportation? This is a purely political question, and one that I think should be discussed reasonably, without the taboo or shame so commonly associated with drug consumption. It remains to be seen if cannabis legalization will significantly cut into the cartel's profits, as it seems that for now, cartels have simply moved to supplying other illegal drugs in greater quantities. But perhaps with full legalization, this could take the wind out of their sails. Just some food for thought. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing, commenting, or even just liking the video. Stay safe and stay curious.